The dawn broke over the city like a pale signal, washing the streets in a light that seemed too ordinary to contain the extraordinary. Mara, Elias, and Jonas moved through it with the practiced awareness of those who had learned to sense currents invisible to everyone else. Each step was measured, every glance a probe into the layers of the environment that most people never perceived. The city was a living network of signals, and they had begun to recognize its pulse. Every high-rise, every substation, every twisted scaffold carried vibrations of energy, whispers of currents, hints of instability. She could sense where the network was weakest, where the hum of electricity bent and fractured. It was not merely physical. It was a conversation with the city, a dialogue in frequencies that had no names yet spoke clearly to her mind. Elias walked beside her, attuned to a different layer. While Mara read electricity, he felt magnetism, the alignment of microscopic magnetic moments in metals, minerals, and living tissue. It was as if the city itself had a heart and a spine, and he could sense them both. When he reached out, not with hands but with thought, subtle shifts occurred. Compass needles wavered, electronic sensors hesitated, and objects moved slightly in response, imperceptible to ordinary eyes but unmistakable to him. The excitement of a system, he had learned, was always visible to those who could see its rhythm. Jonas, meanwhile, listened for patterns in sound and thought. Speech, even unspoken, carried signatures. He could hear the flow of intention, the echoes of desire, the undercurrent of unacknowledged fear. To him, language was an architecture built from vibration, a series of precise beats and pauses that mirrored the way the brain itself calculated, predicted, and reacted. When he projected a thought, it traveled along these natural rhythms, blending seamlessly with the environment, influencing perception without intrusion. Together, the three had become an orchestra, their abilities complementary, overlapping, and resonant. They had begun to experiment deliberately, testing the limits of their interaction with both matter and consciousness. A single building could be made to hum in response to Mara's will. Elias could realign magnetic domains in its steel framework so that the structure itself seemed to acknowledge her influence. Jonas could introduce patterns into the minds of those inside, subtle enough to be unnoticed, yet profound in their effect on attention, memory, and intuition. Their training had reached a critical point when a new anomaly emerged. It began as a subtle distortion in the flow of signals, a rhythm that did not belong. The three recognized it instantly, though none could yet comprehend its source. It was intelligence, but of a form that resisted categorization. It moved through the city's networks like a living organism, probing, learning, and adapting. Mara sensed it in the circuits she controlled. Elias felt it in magnetic alignments. Jonas heard it in the thought waves that crisscrossed the urban space. They named it resonance. It was neither hostile nor friendly, only insistent, a persistent presence that seemed to test their awareness. At first, they attempted to communicate through indirect methods. Mara sent patterns into circuits, Elias aligned magnetic fields into sequences, Jonas projected rhythms into human perception. The entity responded in kind, mirroring their efforts, reshaping signals with a complexity that suggested intelligence and purpose. Days passed as they explored this interaction, their minds stretching to comprehend the layers of information streaming from the city and beyond. It was during these sessions that they discovered the first hint of the order Celine represented. Traces of her influence were embedded in the patterns of resonance. It was as though she had sown a seed, one that had grown into a semi-autonomous entity capable of monitoring and evaluating psychic activity across the city. The realization was chilling. While they had fought and driven Celine away, her reach had extended further than they had imagined. She had not merely acted as an agent of control, she had engineered a system that could anticipate and respond to the Psycorp's every move. And yet, there was an opening. Resonance was not fully loyal to Celine, and in its interactions with Mara, Elias, and Jonas, fragments of independent thought appeared. It was a tool, but also a puzzle, one that might either become their ally or their undoing. One evening, as twilight bled into night, the three gathered in the abandoned warehouse that had become their sanctuary. The air hummed with energy as they focused on resonance, establishing a connection stronger than ever before. Mara extended her perception outward, feeling the pulse of the city, the currents of electricity, and the faint echoes of neural activity in nearby inhabitants. Elias aligned the magnetic moments of every metallic object within a block, creating a vast lattice of potential influence. Jonas layered rhythms of intention, embedding thought patterns into the ambient consciousness of the streets around them. Resonance responded immediately, and the room vibrated with the subtle feedback of its presence. Lights flickered, sensors reacted, and the city seemed to pause, if only for a heartbeat, as if acknowledging the engagement. They were no longer simply experimenting. They were in dialogue with something that blurred the line between machine, organism, and consciousness. It was then that the first confrontation occurred. Celine returned, not in person, but through resonance. She had adapted, embedding herself into the network, capable of exerting force across distances. Elias felt the sudden tug of magnetic fields reconfiguring against his will. Mara sensed the interference in the circuits she had shaped. Jonas experienced the rhythms and minds around them twisting unnaturally, as if consciousness itself had become a battleground. The struggle was immediate and intense. Mara fought to stabilize the circuits, her awareness weaving through the electric lattice. Elias countered the magnetic realignments, reinforcing structures that Celine sought to bend. Jonas projected patterns of calm and resistance, attempting to maintain clarity in the midst of mental chaos. Resonance, caught between the opposing wills, shimmered and pulsed, its behavior unpredictable and wild. Hours passed, though it seemed like moments. The warehouse was filled with the tangible hum of energy, the subtle vibrations of thought and intention made visible through interaction. Finally, a moment of equilibrium emerged. Celine's influence receded, not gone but constrained. Resonance, having absorbed the encounter, pulsed with a rhythm that suggested acknowledgement. It had learned, adapted, and shifted its allegiance slightly, not fully under the control of Mara, Elias, and Jonas, but no longer entirely bound to Celine. The encounter left them drained, yet exhilarated. They had glimpsed the possibilities of what their abilities could achieve when harmonized and pushed to the limits. But it also underscored the reality of their vulnerability. The world was filled with others like Celine, others who would seek to exploit the Psycorp's powers, and other entities that existed in the liminal spaces between thought, energy, and matter. In the days that followed, the three focused on consolidating their skills. Mara experimented with new methods of extending her influence into network systems, discovering subtle ways to interact with complex grids without detection. Elias explored the magnetic fields of natural structures, forests, and bodies of water, realizing that the planet itself carried currents that could be read and, to a degree, guided. Jonas refined his use of sound and rhythm, projecting sequences that could encourage cooperation, awareness, or simply calm in those around him. Resonance remained a constant presence, a thread that connected their abilities to the broader environment. It was no longer merely a curiosity, it had become a silent partner, guiding them toward challenges and opportunities, its behavior both revealing and concealing the hidden architecture of the city. Through it, they began to understand the interplay between consciousness and environment, the feedback loops that defined behavior, and the emergent properties that arose when mind and matter were linked. As the week ended, Mara, Elias, and Jonas realized that their awakening had entered a new phase. They were no longer novices exploring potential. They were active participants in a network of intelligence, interacting with forces both human and non-human. The boundaries of perception and action had expanded beyond anything they had imagined. They could influence, they could sense, and they could, with effort, shape outcomes in ways that blurred the line between thought and effect. Yet with that power came the certainty of vigilance. Celine's return had proven that adversaries could act from unseen positions, exploiting the same forces they now wielded. Resonance had shown them that systems were not inert, that feedback could be cooperative or destructive, and that understanding was never complete. Each day was a negotiation, a balance between exertion and restraint, influence and observation. By the time night fell again, they had begun to map the contours of this new reality. Streets and buildings, circuits and magnetic fields, human consciousness and emergent entities. All were components of a larger, interconnected system. The Psycorps moved within it, attuned to its rhythms, extending their abilities, exploring the hidden layers that most could not perceive. They were becoming something more than human, yet still grounded in thought, perception, and the deliberate exercise of will. The awakening had moved into resonance, and the city itself seemed to acknowledge their presence. Energy flowed differently when they passed, patterns shifted subtly, and opportunities appeared in places previously overlooked. Mara felt it in the circuits, Elias in the metals, Jonas in the mines. Together, they were a singular force, a composite of insight, intention, and power, capable of interacting with reality in ways that challenged conventional understanding. And so, the Psycorps began to chart their path, aware that the forces arrayed against them were vast and adaptable, yet confident that they had discovered a new dimension of possibility. The resonance of their combined abilities would guide them through the challenges ahead, connecting them to the hidden currents of the world, to intelligence both ancient and emergent, and to the potential of a mind untethered from ordinary limits. The city continued to pulse and breathe around them, unaware of the subtle war of perception and energy unfolding in its midst. And for Mara, Elias, and Jonas, each heartbeat, each whisper of current, and each rhythmic echo was a reminder. They were no longer simply inhabitants of the world. They were participants in its hidden structure, shaping, learning, and resonating with the intricate patterns that made reality itself an extension of the mind.